All right, everyone, we will get started. This is Alteryx Designer Transform Tools, and my name is Robert Frere, and I am with Data Meaning, and I have been working in the BI space for over 20 years. I've worked with on the database side a lot. I've written a lot of SQL statements and designed a lot of data warehousing projects. And so the last couple of years, I've been devoted in the Alteryx realm. And so Alteryx Designer is one of those things that I really enjoy. Our company, Data Meaning, we are an Alteryx Premier Partner, which means that we assist them in enabling customers to grow and become experts on Alteryx themselves. We also will come in and help support a team to build a project out when they're looking to accomplish that. So another thing I always enjoy doing is teaching classes, and I've taught some computer-based classes on the college level, and so I really enjoy helping people learn. One of the things that we're going to do today in this webinar is we're using the question and answer, the QA functionality within the Zoom webinar. So if you have any questions that come up in your mind about something that we're covering, go ahead and go to the Q&A function and type in your question there, and we will do our best to get an answer to you as quickly as possible. All right, so right now it's just me here to answer the question. So it may take me a moment to get to your question, but I will be looking at and looking for those questions as we're going on. All right, so with no further ado, let's get to the topic. So today is the fourth of our five webinars on Alteryx Designer. We've covered the introduction to Designer, blending data sets, cleansing or parsing data sets, and today I want to look at the transform tools in detail. And of course, we've used at least one of the transform tools in earlier sessions, but I want to get more detail on each one of the tools that are available in the transform. And so what we're going to be doing today, the way we're going to run this class is that I'm going to be going over just like one or two slides on each of the tools. And as I touch that tool, I'm then, after I finish showing you the slide, I'm going to go into Alteryx Designer directly so that we can see the tools in action. And we have a series of small workflows that we're going to work on for each of the tools that we cover. All right, and hopefully you can be back next week for establishing dynamic workflows, which will be the final of our 5 Alteryx Designer webinars. All right, so the agenda, you guys can read the agenda. We're going to be looking at the different pieces, the summarize, crosstab and transpose, etc., as we touch each one of the tools that are in the transform tool palette in Alteryx Designer by default. All right, so let's get right to it, the transform tool overview. So these are the 7 tools that are part of the transform tool palette, and I've got here the icon blown up here so we can see each of the icons, and also a small snippet from the Alteryx Designer just to show you the order that the tools come in here. So you guys can read, so I won't go through each one of these directly. I'll just mention that in a lot of cases, the icons do help you figure out what's going on with these tools. This count records, right? We got a little clicker here. You can count each row in your data set. That's really important. The Crosstab and Transpose are two tools that have the opposite effect of each other, and that's where you can see in the Crosstab you have data that's in a more vertical orientation, or fewer columns, more rows. And what the Crosstab will do is it'll take it into a more columns, fewer rows, or a horizontal orientation to your data. The Transpose will do the exact opposite. It starts off with data in several columns, and it takes those columns and reduces them to one column and many rows with the corresponding data that's in here. And we will, like I said, I won't read each one of these, but we will talk about each one. And one tool that I'll tell you that I think is a little underused, but is also very powerful, is this arrange tool. If you're trying to format your data sets in a particular fashion, the arrange tool can really help you accomplish that task. All right, so let's get into the actual tools then. The first part we're going to cover is the Crosstab and Transpose. Oops, sorry about that. My mouse got me to the wrong spot. Transform tools, Crosstab, and Transpose. All right, so what does the Crosstab tool do? I've got this little illustration of a data set, and you can see these arrows where we had a different column for each of these months in our original data set. Each one of those column names is represented as a value in the name column here, or this one's called name 2. In that name 2 column, each one of the columns becomes a row. Then, since this is the first entry for this all creatures great and small, each of the values that are in the columns in the original data set get oriented to be row values in our solution set. And this is just a snapshot of the configuration where we have our key columns, which are the columns that are not moving. We're going to move the other columns, but these are the columns that do not move. In this case, the name column, where we have the 5 different rows or 6 different rows for the names here in the original data set. We're going to still have the names as its own individual column in our solution data set. We'll just have more rows because of the translation of the other columns that we have here. And then the data column configuration is where we say which one of the columns that we want, or the many columns that we want to have be transformed. All right, so that's the Crosstab. And just like it, but opposite, is the Transpose. As you might expect, we go from having different rows with the values here, January, February, March, etc. Instead of that orientation, we flatten things out to a vertical orientation. And with that vertical orientation, again, the numbers get set underneath those columns, and now we have a column name for every row that we selected. Now, the settings in Alteryx are shown here. And again, we have the group by column. This column is staying the same. It's staying in the same location. So the name column does that. Then you designate the single column. This is key here. You designate the single column that's going to be changed into multiple columns. So this is, in this case, month. I apologize for that. This name 2 should be renamed month. And then the value columns are the numbers that are going to go under each of the specified columns. Now, this bottom section we're going to see here in a minute is very important for us, because what it's saying is, let's say there are multiple rows that have all creatures great and small in January. So if you have multiple rows with the same month and the same name, how do you combine the values together? Do you want to sum them, average them, etc.? Those are your options that we have here. So in Alteryx, we're going to look at that, and we're going to use the aggregation values in here to get us more insight into our data. All right, so at this point, one more slide. This is just a visual again. So we've seen the pictures of it. Now this is just another way of visualizing the same thing that's happening with the crosstab. And first thing I'll want you to see is that grouping columns, header columns, data columns is the starting point for a crosstab, and it is the ending point for the transpose. We have our grouping columns, and key columns are the same. The data columns is the same as header columns, and the data is of course the same as the data. And so the crosstab is the opposite or the mirror of transpose, and from the crosstab you go from a fewer columns, more rows, into more columns and therefore fewer rows. And on the transpose, again, these two, the end result of the crosstab is the same as the opening status of the transpose data sets. All right, so though that is crosstab and transpose. So let's take a look at these in Alteryx directly. Oh, apologize for that. Get that here. Now let's get to Alteryx. All right, so we've got our crosstab and our transpose tools that we want to look at here. Let me get my things set up over here. All right, so let's look at our original data that we have available to us then. We have our data, and if I put a browse tool at the end of this and I run this data set, what I'll see is that I've got a data set with 9,400 records. It's got customer transaction information. So I have various columns that give me information about what customers bought at a particular time. All right, so in this case, what I want to do is I want to be able to take this information and I want to be able to use the transpose tool to set up my information. So I'm going to start over here and look at what I've got available. I've got my data across my months. All right, so let me I'm going to use a different data set for this piece. Oh, I'm in the wrong place. I'm in my count records. Sorry. Let me go to my transpose crosstab. All right. So we're going to take this data, which is actually our data. We have our books by our months, and we're going to use our transpose table to change the orientation. So I set up my table here, bring in my transpose, and beforehand I've got the name and I've got my data across multiple columns. So now I want to change the orientation here to a vertical orientation. So let's configure this tool then. So when we configure this tool, the first part is that key column. So we want to be able to check out what we are going to be looking at. So if I bring over this, just to give us a reminder of what the transpose looks like, we're going to designate our key column first. So that's the data that's not moving. In our case, and I want you to see, while all these columns are highlighted, when I select the very first column here to be named, it then unselects it as a data column because it cannot be both a key column and a data column at the same time. All right, so I set that up there. And now I can look at my information here. And I've got my crosstab and my transpose. When I run this, I'm going to put a browse tool at the end. When I run this then, we can look at the before and after. So before, we have 13 columns and 13 fields. Afterwards, we have 3 columns and we have 156 records. So we see that each one of the columns now became values in our row table. All right, now if we were going to do this, and let's just look at what would this look like if we were trying to sum up our values, because when we have data in a vertical orientation like this, it makes it simpler to use some of the tools in Alteryx to accomplish the task that we're looking for. In this case, if I grabbed my summarize tool and I brought it and connected it after the transpose, and then I wanted to be able to calculate my values, or my sales in this case, by each one of the books that are in this data set. What I can do is I can select my name, which is going to be my grouping column, and then I'm going to take the value and I'm going to sum up the values here. And when I put a browse tool at the end here and run it, what this is showing me is by having this vertical orientation, I was able to take the different rows and sum them up, and now I've got one value for each of my 13 books that I have. I have a total value. Now, if the data was still in this format, in order to bring all that data together, I would have had to have taken my data set and used the formula tool, and then I would have had to create my total column by taking each one of my values. Actually, this would have gone from here. I would have had to take each one of the values from the column header, and I would have started with January, then I would have added February, etc., through all my months. So this is would have been more cumbersome to accomplish, but by having the transpose and the summarize together, I'm able to quickly get a total sales number for each one of my books, as opposed to having to put in 12 different columns for this calculation here. And also, this calculation is more dynamic because it will take however many rows are generated from the transpose. So let's say if we were in the middle of the year, we might have only 6 columns worth of data. It would have transposed it into 6 rows, and then my sum would have summed up those 6 rows. If there were 9 months, it would have summed up 9 rows. But the formula tool I would have had to change this formula for every time a new month came in. If I wanted to sum up all the rows, I would have to come in here and edit this formula tool. So that's a little bit more time intensive, and so that's why we don't do it that way. All right, now in addition to this, if we took another data set, then let's take the data and let's start it the other way. So if we started our data already transposed like this, then what we can do is we can use our Crosstab tool to bring our data back together in a columnar set. So in this case, taking the data input, let me run this here. All right, so taking the input into here, I'll see that right now I have this vertical orientation, and this column that is called month has my entries, 1 row for every month. Now I want to take this then and I want to do the opposite. I want to bring it back to the more horizontal orientation. So in order to do that, I take the name column, which is going to stay right where it is. I'm going to take that name column. Then in my change column header, that's going to be month, because that's the one that's going to become multiple columns. So I take this, I put in month, and then it's saying, hey, I can't have the same value for both of these, which is fine because my actual values are in my value column. All right, so in this case, I want to sum things up. And by summing them up, I get to see my values across in each one's going to be there for each of the columns that are available. All right, so now when I run this, I can see that I have my columns here, just like I started off with in this other one initially. So I've got my columns, I've got my rows, and everything is now set up in that horizontal um, orientation. All right, so this is one of the things I want to show you here in addition is having the fact that we have a transpose and a crosstab and that they do, they're mirror images of each other. Sometimes we can use that fact to help us out. For instance, if we started off with a data set, so I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to put in my data set. Right, so this is like we started off with. I've got all my months. Now, what if in my goal was to create, I wanted to be able to create totals, a total column. So I want at the side here, I want another column with totals for every month for a single book. And then also I wanted to create a totals row that gives me a grand total for all the sales in January and then in February, etc. So there's a few different ways that we could do this. We could use some summarized tools. We could union things back together and join them back together. But there's a process that is quite commonly used in Alteryx that helps us get that total row and the total column quickly. And that is, first we take our data and we use our transpose tool so that we can change the orientation of the tool. We click on the name just like we did up above. All 12 of our months are here. All right, then when we run that, we'll see that just like above, we have our vertical orientation. But now, since we've got mirror images, we grab our crosstab and we directly connect the crosstab to the transpose. Now, this time we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take that name column. That's going to stay fixed. Our column that we're changing now is called name 2, and our value is going to be value. Now we're going to want to summarize these when it brings it back into the more horizontal orientation. But if we scroll down in these aggregating values here, this is what I wanted to point out, is also here I have an option for a total column and a total row. So when I put a browse tool at the end here and I run this, what you're going to see is by putting these two tools back to back and selecting total column and total row, I was able to take my data set, have the exact same orientation of my data set. Now I've got a totals row, and now I have a totals column, so that I've done that with a minimal amount of work by using the transpose and the crosstab options. All right, so let's go then back to our PowerPoint very briefly, and let's talk about the arrange tool. Now, the arrange tool, as I was mentioning before, is, I'll say, not very widely used, but it is a very powerful tool if you have a specific use case for it. So what does the arrange tool do? Well, the arrange tool is similar to the transpose tool in that what you're doing is you're designating from your original data set. In this case, we had multiple months, and you're going to transpose that data to show one column with multiple rows, one for each month. But here's the difference between the two. Using the arrange tool, as you can see, and I've highlighted here in this picture, is that I created an additional column, or an additional row, sorry, called first quarter. Now this first quarter was not a column in this data set, right? So when if we would have just used the transpose, we would have gotten January, February, March for one product, January, February, March for another product, etc. down the line. But by using the arrange tool, we were able to create another column that was also part of our data set as well. So we were able to create that even though it wasn't part of our data set. So now, so let me jump out of here and let's look at how we do that with the arrange tool. All right, so the arrange tool it's pretty straightforward if we wanted just to take our data. So I've got my data here and I want to take this data and I want to compare the transpose and the transform tool. I want to look at both of those together. So first, if I wanted to take my data and I wanted to change the orientation of the months, let's do that first. So just like we had done before, we're going to grab our transpose tool. We're going to connect it to our data set. And now in this case, this does actually highlight something that may be a question that you might have had before, which is we can take the product. We don't have to choose all of the columns in our data set to show up after our transpose. In this case, I just want my product here, and I'm going to leave the rest of my data is going to be, I'm going to unselect my category, suggested age, and average monthly sales, and I'm going to just take those months with me. So when I do that and I run this, what I'll see is now I have my product information, and now I've got that same vertical orientation where I've got one column with all 12 of my months in it, and then the values going next to me. All right, now, how would we do the same thing with the arrange tool? If we took our arrange tool and brought it in and set up our data set, then what we can do is if we look here on the configuration window, the first thing that I would do is I would come over here and I would select my product, because that's going to be the column that I'm going to be grouping by. All right, then I'm going to say I want a column. I'm going to add a column to my data set here. And in here, my column header, I want this one to be, I can call my column header the name. Actually, this one will be the value that I've got here. And I'm going to add a new description. Oh, and I forgot to select my values. Now I can select which ones I want. I want January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. All right, so I've got my data there. Okay, now from this place, oops, I don't want to click that. I can come down in here and I can type in my values for that are going to be either my row values here. So I'm going to just do a abbreviation. All right. All right. Now when I set this up like this, and I put my browse tool at the end, now when I run this, you'll see that I have my values for each of the months, just like I did up here with my transpose, and when I came up with my month names and my values. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. But now let's get into something a little bit more complex. To sort of grease our wheels here, I added this formula tool because if I wanted to make a more complex output for my data using my transpose tools, it would take a few different steps. So let me show you first what I would do with my arrange tool, and then show you how we would do the same thing in our using the transpose tool. So first with the arrange tool, if I take my data and I connect it to my formula tool, I can come in here and I can set my different settings. So in this case, I'm going to take all of my fixed columns, everything that's not a month. I'm going to go with product, category, suggested age range, and average monthly sales. Those are all going to be my key columns, so they're not going to change. All right, then I'm going to add my my data for this range tool. So I'm going to come down here to my column and say add. All right, and so in this case, I'm going to take my column header. I'm going to call this one my Q1 sales, and the columns that I'm going to have here, I'm going to have January, February, March, and then when I scroll down, I'm going to take my Q1 total as well. So I've got January, February, March, and then Q1 total. Click on there. All right, and then in my description, I'll go ahead and put in my January, my February, and my March, and then here I'm going to have that Q1 total. All right, so let's look at what this data looks like. Out browse tool afterwards. You can see here that what we have is we have our columns that we're staying the same, and then now our month columns, we have split those out into different rows for January, February, March, and then Q1 total. And if we added up these three values together, we would get this Q1 total value. So it's the equivalent of having added another row here, a totals row, to my data. So now let's make this a little bit more complicated so that we can see the value of the arrange tool. So let's say I wanted to bring in a second quarter of data into this, right? So if I came back here and I said column add, right? So in this one, I'm going to go with my Q2 sales, and this time I'm going to pick April, May, and June. And this time I'm not going to select second quarter. So I want to show you something that's available here as well. So I got April, May, June, right? Then I hit OK. All right, now what I've got here then is I've got April, May, June for second quarter sales. And when I hit the run here and I look at my data, now what you're going to see is I've got Q1 sales and then I've got Q2 sales. But right now, because I have this Q1 total, I don't have a value in here for Q2. So let me come back here, and if I take this and I can change my name over here, and I'm going to make this one, instead of Q1 total, I'm going to call this one my quarterly total. And so then in my Q2 sales, I'm going to come down here, and from all my available columns, I'm going to come down here to the Q2 total. And now when I run this, I get both my January, February, March, and my quarterly sales here. And then I've got my my total sales for January and for February. So by adding that second column, I was able to have April, May, and June data in there as well. All right. Now, if I was using the Transpose tool, how would I accomplish the same thing? Well, I could come down here, and with the Transpose tool, I'm going to bring in a couple of copies of my Transpose tool. All right. And if I connected these together to my data set, and then one more Transpose tool for my total, I could come in here and I could select my columns that I'm going to key on, right? And then this time I'm going to just go with the first quarter's values, so I don't need any of these. All right, gonna get rid of that extra one there that's hiding. September is gone, so I've only got January, February, March here. Then in this one, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to choose, I'm not going to choose January, February, March. I'm instead going to choose uh, April, May, and June, unselect the other months. All right. Then on this final one here, I'm going to do the same thing, product category. With this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unselect all of these except for Q1 and Q2. All right, so when I do that, then you'll see that I've got Q1 and Q2 here. I've got my January, February, March here, my April, May, June here. Then if I bring these all together and I join these based on my column names, what I can do is I can join these two guys together. Right, I'm going to stick all those together, and before I do this, I'm going to put in a select statement here so that I can limit the columns that I'm bringing in. Right, so in this first one, I want to bring in all my values. So I've got my, all right, I'm going to bring in everything there, product category, etc. Second one here, I'm going to bring in those same values, right? So I'll leave that there. And in my third one, I'll bring in this is going to be my sales, quarterly sales. All right. And these are going to be the values. All right, so when I bring those all together based on my record position, so in this case in my join, I'm not going to have a specific row. I'm going to select by position, and I'm going to choose my data. I've got 1, 2, and 3. So, and in each of these other cases, since I've got my product category, suggested age, and things up here, I don't need these again. So I'm not going to show those, and I'm not going to show my product category, suggested age, and I don't need those for input 2 or 3. I just need the sales that come with it. All right. So then when I run this, what I get is I get my data, and I've got my January, February, March, my April, May, June, and then I've got my totals here together. So you can see that by using the arrange tool, I can select my data in more customized ways in a simpler fashion than having to go through all this work to set up the others. All right, so the arrange tool then allows you to do those more complex manual operations. All right, so back to our PowerPoint then. All right, we're gonna briefly go through the summarize tool because we have touched on this in our other sessions, and also a lot of my examples for the rest of the tools also use the summarize. So let's go ahead and just take a quick look. What is the summarize tool about? Well, the summarize tool, when we look at it, is a lot like a pivot table in Excel. So in a pivot table in Excel, what you do is when you are in Excel and you're creating a pivot table, right, you have columns that you want to show up on rows. So that's what we've got here. We've got our country and our year. Those are set up on the rows. And then we've got values that we have set up on, so our metrics that'll show up inside of our pivot table. So if I wanted to add scores here, you can see that I've got I've got these two columns, and then I've got my sum and my attendance. They affect the look and what values are in my pivot table down here. I could say that I don't want year, so I'm going to remove this field, and we'll see how this changes when I remove it. So I'm going to remove that field, and now we have just our winners column, which is our countries, and they are set up with the sum of attendance and total scores that are set up in this pivot table. So the idea behind the pivot table then is you're taking your original data set and you're grouping that information by your row columns, and then you're also taking those grouped together columns, because we can see here that we've got multiple rows for Italy in this data set. So then down here in our pivot table, we have one row for Italy because it combined the other rows down together. So when you're combining numbers, we have to tell it, in this case, we're going to sum our numbers, and that's going to get us our 254 right here. All right, so when we do the summarize tool, then we're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to take our data. I'll just grab that real quick. New workflow. I'm going to take my data then, and I'm going to look at my columns. I'm going to open up, this one is an Excel file. I'm going to click on my WA. All right, I'm going to grab my sheet one. Oh, actually, this is a named range. You got my scores. All right, so in this case, I'm bringing in my values, and actually, I do want the other one. Apologize. I'm going to come up here to sheet one. I want to refresh my data. All right, so then I want my first 20 columns, my first 20 rows, sorry. So I'm going to come over here to sample. I want my first 20 rows. All right. Now, when I do this and I look at my data set, then what I have here is I've got that data set that was in Excel. I can use my summarize tool to do the same thing as I did in Excel. I can grab my summarize tool. I want to say I want to group by winners, and I want to sum up my attendance. So when I do that and I run this, then the numbers I get here are the same numbers that I got in my Excel by creating that pivot table. I could also go back to my attendance numbers, my total score number, and I could come in here and I could sum this as well, just like we did it before, and I could add year and add a group by here. So now I'm going to group by year and winner. And when I run this, I would get my same values as I did from my pivot table in Excel. So that's what I wanted to show you those. All right, now going back to our PowerPoint and looking at our running total. All right, running total is pretty simple. It's summarizing the data. If we look at our sample here, we can see that our running total for the first row is 53 because that we only have one row to look at. But in the second row, it's 123. So it took 53 and then it added 70 to it and it got to 123. And then 158 added more and got to 281, etc. Down as it keeps going up the number of rows that are here. So when you use the running total tool, you want to make sure that you have already sorted your data so that you can get your data in the right order for processing. Because one of the things you can do in a running total tool is you can set where to break that total. So in essence, if I could do that by country in this case, or maybe by year, or maybe by quarter, so that when let's say I did it by quarter, when that quarter changed, then my running total would restart. And so having the running total and having it sorted first is essential for doing proper use of the running total. So let's just take a quick look at what the running total would look like then in Alteryx. So if we grabbed our data and we looked at the running total, gonna grab this running total. All right. So if I took my running total from my data set and I said here that what I want is I want to create a running total based on the total score, I could then put my browse tool here, run this, and what I'll see when I look at my data then is it's got this running total for total score. So we've got 6, and then 3 more makes 9, 6 more 15, etc., all the way down till we get to the end. So that's the kind of data that will allow us to with that running total gives us a value for the total score. Now it is flexible in that we could take that same data and we could say that I don't just want a total score running total, I also want an attendance number as well. So by setting that second one, I can run this and I can see my values for, I can see my value running total values for both my total score and my attendance. All right. So then the only other thing that we can show here is if we took our same data and I wanted to show you that we can take this running total, stick it here, and in this case, when I'm looking at my data coming in, you can see I've got countries, years, and then I've got quarters. What I want to do is I'm going to set into this, I'm going to set the quarter and the country as breaking points, and I'm going to create a running total of my quantity. So then when I look at this and I run it through, all right, what we can see is that my running total keeps going up for first quarter 2012. And then I've got a lot of rows here for first quarter 2012, but pretty soon it changes. And when we see here, when it changed from quarter 1 2012 to quarter 1 2013, the number reset back to 1 row worth of value, etc. So when you group it, it resets the value for the running total. All right, let's get back here and let's click on the weighted average. All right, so the weighted average is another one of the tools. Again, this tool I don't think is used quite as often as maybe it could be, but to give you the idea of a weighted average, if I took a regular average, right? If I took these values and I summed up my income, I would get 600,000. If I summed up the number of rows, I've got 6 rows. I could then take 600,000 divided by 6, and I would get my average of 100,000. But that's not taking into account the weight. In this case, my weight for Orlando is 2, where everything else is 1, which is the equivalent meaning of saying that I want this value for Orlando to count as twice as much as any one of these other values are shown here. So in this case, it's the equivalent of if I had 2 rows with Orlando in it. So then if I summed up those values, it would go from 600,000 to 710. And now my number of rows is 7. When I did my weighted average, I would end up with 101,428, which is a different number than my 100,000 average. So weighted average is specifically used when you want to count some of your rows as being more valuable than other rows. So if I flip out of here real quick, I'll show you the weighted average then. And the weighted average, if I took my data, right, I've got some data here, and if I showed you in the tool here, if I took my summarize tool and I just said, look, I want to take the income and I want to get an average of my income, then what we would see is that my value would end up being 100,000, just like in our illustration. But when we grab the weighted average tool, same data set, right? This time my value is going to be my income, and my weight is going to be in my weight column, and I want to look at the income. Oh, wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. This is my grouping field. I don't want to set that as income. So in this case, I run this, and you'll see that my average is that 101,428.57, whatever. So that by using the weighted average, some of the values are more important than others. So where might you use this? Well, in one case I wanted to show you is that, let's say you had different companies and you had satisfaction surveys from each of those companies. Now, if I did a straight average again on those companies, I might look at my data and determine that my average satisfaction score for these companies is 86.87. But you know what? If I took a closer look at my data when I came in here, what I could see is that some companies, their revenue is like 985,000, 947,000, 909,000, 705,000. Those numbers are over, well over 500,000. But the rest of my companies, the revenue was under 100,000. So it may be that I decide that, you know what, these 5 companies here are worth more to me than the others. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to use my weighted average tool, and I'm going to say that my value that I'm looking for is my satisfaction score. That's what I want to find the average of. And for a weight, I don't have a weight column, but I do have my annual revenue. That's the column I want to use. So if they have a higher annual revenue, I value their satisfaction more than I do the satisfaction of companies that are not bringing in as much revenue. So when I do that and I run it, then what we can see is that it goes from an average score of 86.875 to my weighted average is 88.15. So giving more weight to the companies that are generating more revenue for me, I can say that my company is doing pretty good. I've got an 88 satisfaction score as opposed to the 85 that was for the overall. So that may be one way that you use the count records. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump straight to my count records tool, which is a rather simple tool. But so what it does is, if you're looking at a number of rows that you have in a data set, and you use the count records, you connect it here, and I run, it just gives me a simple it'll give me one row output with the number of rows that are in that data set. All right, so that is not all that exciting, but it can be used in a lot of ways that can be very valuable. For instance, if I came in here and I was interested in in different product categories, and if I wanted to say, hey, I want to know where the product category, right, equals, in this case, technology, right? If I ran that and I looked at my data, I would see that I've got 2,312 rows here. Well, if I want to examine what's the difference between using this count tool and a summarize tool where I count up my values. But in this case, I get my count tool and my summarize tool. In my summarize tool, I'm just going to count the number of IDs. So just to see how this works, when I run this, I get one row with 2312, and I get one row with 2312. So everything's pretty much the same. All right. Now, what if I connected to these? I connected to this some email tools, right? So I want to email a group with the information for um, for my data. Now, here's the issue that comes in, is if I have my email tool connected, and I'm going to copy this and paste it here from my other screen here. Now, here's the thing. I want this sent out to the owner of my data. But let's say in my filter, if I change technology to test, right? Then what happens is when I run this, we're going to see something that's specifically different. Now, what happens here is in the count record, if there is no data coming into my count record, then what it does is it generates one row with a count of 0. But my summarize tool, when there is no data coming in, it doesn't generate any rows. So if I had an email tool connected to this, if the count record tool would send out an email saying, hey, the count of your data is 0 rows for that data type. But the summarize tool would not send out your email because it had no input coming in. So that's the difference between the count records and a regular summarize tool, because the count record, you can always count on having one row as your response, even if that value that you get from that one row is 0, it still is valuable when you're trying to use it as a trigger for a follow-on tool. All right, so in this case, by using this, I was able to get emails sent, but without using it, no email gets sent with a value for that particular product category. All right, so taking all that and want to find out, do we have any questions that you might have before we end this session? You can go ahead and type them into the Q&A. All right, and I want to remind you that this recording will be available, and will be a link to this recording will be sent out to you so that you can review this. And if you have any questions, you can contact our sales team and let them know, and they can help you out and get you any of the other recordings as well as needed. All right, so if I'm going to give you another couple seconds here if you have a question. I know that we're running a little bit short on the time, but feel free to contact us with questions on Designer. And don't forget that this Friday we have another webinar on Server coming up as well. So Alteryx is a very powerful tool, and we'd love to help you gain the most out of your investment in the tool. Thank you very much, and I hope you guys have a great day. And I'm going to stop sharing that, and I will hopefully see you all next week. Thank you very much.